The word unprecedented has been tossed around a lot in the last few years, but it truly is fair game when we describe the 2024 election. By most accounts, it will be an event in which U.S. democracy as we know it will be on the line, and the free press will be tested to its limits. Along the way, technology will be weaponized to distort reporting and proliferate misinformation, and it will also be drawn upon to clarify and amplify facts as trust in the news business continues to erode. Our keynote discussion today looks to unpack the dynamics of this election, the stakes underpinning it, and how news organizations plan to rise to the moment. And so to do so, I've convened a CEO and an anchor to have this conversation. I'd like to introduce them now. Adam Simpson is the president and CEO of the EW Scripps Company, and Connell McShane is an anchor for News Nation. Welcome to you both. As a country, the U.S. is facing a widening political schism, and the media, both national and local, are grappling with a very growing, deepening sense of consumer mistrust. My first questions are meant to look at how you're addressing these interrelated problems. And Adam, I want to start with you. TV newsrooms have long been wired as a headline service. And how do you think that's contributed to the problem first, and are they capable of being rewired?
Yes, they're capable of being rewired, and I guess I'd maybe even sort of take issue with the premise that they were wired in the first place as a headline service. I think TV newsrooms have been developed to meet the needs of our consumers based on the technology that we use, right? The broadcast delivery. And that led us to some extent to an over-reliance on technology, an over-reliance on what at the time was our point of differentiation, live, and urgency, which back in the 80s and 90s was the thing that defined us away from the morning and the afternoon newspaper, but today is not all that unique. Unfortunately, we have completely engineered our workflows in order to meet the needs of that component of what we are, live, and we have staffed for that. We have organized our day's activities for that. We have chosen coverage for that. We have built a reputation for covering stories near to where we are located because of that. And that has left us in this predicament with a product that doesn't meet the needs of most of our consumers. And so it's not so much that we're a headline service, it's that we've got an over-reliance on the notion of television is urgent and live and we can break in at any time, and especially in local. I'm sure we'll talk about networks and national differently, but especially in local. And that's created a finely tuned machine, especially given the economic pressures we're under, with few reporters covering few stories a day and underserving the communities where we operate, leading to one of the factors that I'm convinced has led to this lack of trust. So are we capable of rewiring? Yes. And we're attempting to do so. Is it easy? No. And we are taking our licks for it.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that right now. You have been for many months now in the midst of a very dramatic reorganization at Scripps with some very hard choices that you've been making to reallocate, to basically enable more reporters at the smaller markets, the mid-sized markets, sometimes doubling and tripling, I think, the number of reporters, but you've had to make a lot of hard economic decisions to do that. So can you talk a little bit about that process and how it has been, how you've been going through it so far?
I mean, it's been a difficult year, a painful year, no doubt. When you decide that you need to change things in order to create a more durable model, particularly in our smaller markets, you make a decision that you're going to essentially try to change the entirety of what it is we are known for and what it is we do, but not what it is we should be doing. And what that's led us to do in our smaller markets is reprioritize reporting and deprioritize what I would consider the performative aspects of our business, the live shots, the live element. And so if you were to go to some of our smaller markets, you'd see that we don't have reporters anymore, anchors anymore, excuse me, because many of our newscasts are being composed not live, but asynchronously. We don't have the same kind of production team that we had when we were doing, a live shot for every morning, several live shots for every morning show. And you'd also see that we've got a minimum of 12 or 13 reporters covering the communities where we operate. And those reporters are making significantly more money than they were making just 6 months ago. So the tough decisions we've made, we have essentially really focused on trying to tell stories in the communities that we serve, trying to have more reporters who are better paid, who would like to make a life of journalism in these smaller communities. And we have done so to create a more durable model. You already see one of our peers shuttering newsrooms. We're not going to be in the business of shuttering newsrooms, but we've got to make sure that we learn the lessons that our company lived through in the newspaper business, in which the printing press itself was the impediment for the newspaper business from continuing to serve the communities where they operate. That printing press being a necessity, a necessary part of the economic formation. For us, what we've realized is, if we don't want to be cutting in the newsrooms, we want to be investing in the newsrooms, and so we've made some tough decisions about production, and we've made some tough decisions about presentation in order to fund journalism in the field. It's different in our medium and larger markets, where we'll continue to do live broadcasts and we'll continue to have anchors, but it will look different. There will be more tough decisions still to be made in order for us to go from, in those markets, 12, 15 reporters to a minimum of 25 to 30 reporters in each of those markets.
Well, we'll be following that as that continues to go on. Connell, you are a national news anchor at News Nation, and it is national news that has engendered the most distrust among consumers. So anchors are the face of the news, and so in a way you're the face of the problem. Are you cognizant of that when you're reading the news? When you're
No pressure.
I am now. I like to take Adam's questions, by the way. Those would seem easier than that was like the Taylor Swift start. I'm the problem. It's me.
I don't think anybody would tell you that my questions are easier.
And then Adam starts the paddle by saying the future of news has no news anchors. So I'm feeling really pretty good about my position in life. No, to answer your question, I mean I've always been so. I tell people all the time our job, what we do on the air, is not exactly brain surgery, but what's different than what kind of regular people or my friends do is that there is a public-facing component to it, right? So I started in radio years ago, and they're hearing your voice, and TV, they're seeing you. So I've always been kind of cognizant of this. I don't know that the awareness has raised a little bit in recent years. I mean, maybe it has, but I think that you're right to the extent that we have a trust problem in the industry. Is it bigger in national news? Probably. The numbers show that it is. I think the issue with all of this, there's no quick fix to any of it. So to go back to the first analogy, if you start your career at the beginning in radio, as I did, I was at Bloomberg, and I was a local news reporter here in New York, but then, Bloomberg's a financial news organization, so they said, you better learn how to cover stocks and bonds in a hurry, which I didn't really know much about. So there's not much credibility or trust if you don't have a lot of knowledge of the subject matter, right? So you have to learn, you have to put the work in. So over time, you build up that credibility, that trust with the audience. That's on subject matter. I think the same is true on politics or anything else, that over time you build it. And I think it's been true in any kind of job I have, whether it's working on a crazy morning show with Imus, which I did for a number of years, or a more traditional news program like I'm hosting now. It's the same idea. You build it up over time. The obvious issue on the other side of it is that you can lose it in a hurry. So yeah, I mean, I've always been cognizant of it. I think because people see what we do when we speak, even here. Now someone's watching it on a stream. You have to be cognizant of what you're saying. So yeah, I don't think it's mean, I know there's more awareness in the public of it, but I don't think my awareness has changed that much over the years.
Okay. The cable news ecosystem, particularly in prime time, has inexorably contributed to the moment that in which we find ourselves right now. It's been a very successful business model for Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN to take unabashed political positions, and that horse is probably never going to go back in the barn. But it has had the effect of driving the far left and the far right in this country to essentially the same place, this mentality of I'm right and you're wrong, and the only acceptable outcome is sort of the complete annihilation of the other side. And this is putting incredible pressure on democracy right now. I wonder first, because I have a few questions about this, is there a path for any of these networks to step back from this precipice in cable?
I mean, I think there is. I'm just as a first step in this. I mean, it depends upon the network and upon the situation. I think that we have advantages. You're making changes in your organization. We're relatively new in ours. That, you know, the newness of it does give you some sort of an advantage in establishing the reputation you want at the beginning. I think setting that tone from the beginning is much easier and important. We hope we're doing that now. And this whole idea at News Nation of being this kind of unbiased, fact-based place for news. You know, we could talk over time about the business model and whether that's going to be effective. I mean, you know, it's cliche, but time will obviously tell on that. For the more established organizations, it depends. I mean, you know, Fox is one thing, which, you know, I came from there, so you could talk about that. But take CNN also, for example. I think a lot of the work that they did over the last however many number of years was terrific work. I think that in the last couple of cycles, they became associated with being a far left network in the public's eye, even though many of their reporters and anchors were not that at all. Many of them were straight down the middle journalists, and I think that became a perception problem that was was made worse by comments from the former president and all the rest, and then perception becomes reality. So yeah, I think that they've, just to take one example, have tried to do that and to get back to what their core was. I've heard people there talk about that. So that's one way, but I think it is a little bit easier, you know, if you're redoing something or starting from the beginning to set that tone, and that's what we're trying to do, at least.
Mm-hmm. Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think News Nation, Scripps News have a good shot at reframing what it is Americans should come to expect from 24-hour news. The question originally, is it too late for, I'll just say, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC? In my estimation, yes. Those brands have come to mean something very distinct in the minds of consumers. Pretty tough to step back from where they come. I don't see them actually attempting to do so. That's not to denigrate some of the journalism being done by very good reporters at all of those networks. But I think what we in traditional media sort of have to admit or acknowledge, we like to blame social media for the echo chamber that this country has become. But this really started with traditional media. This really started with the cable news networks, who essentially learned from talk radio that there is an incredibly sound business model by segmenting the American audience and super serving that audience and developing the echo chamber of what it is they want to hear and differentiating talk radio from news. You know, I don't see filling your airwaves 24 hours a day with former shock jocks or talk radio show hosts or opinionated analysts as journalism. And so those brands have the word news in them, and unfortunately that's essentially been co-opted. You know, most Americans at this point would tell you, yes, I believe Fox News is news, or I watch CNN, and you have to sort of help them understand that there's the reporting that's being done by those outlets and good, solid reporters that are placed all over the country, all over the world. And then there is prime time and mornings. And the prime time and mornings contribute to this incredibly destructive environment that we're living in. And you know, so while I think social media is a problem, the reality is much of the polarization in this country has come down to the cable news networks and the super serving of the polarized audiences from a business model perspective.
Especially when you start with the audience and are worried, which I know is what got Fox into trouble, which is you start with the audience and what they want to hear, and then reverse engineer it back the other way. Then that's not what journalism is all about, and you're kind of going in the wrong direction. You're trying to give someone what they want rather than what they need, or whatever other analogy you want to use. But I think that's the bigger problem. The only thing I would add, which I 100% agree with everything Adam is saying, that I've been thinking about it more and more as we start a new network, and I have 2 hours a day now, for example, in the afternoons, is that there's also this advantage in 24-hour news that goes along with. Everybody talks about filling time, and that is a challenge, and then sometimes it's co-opted and it's not done well. But there is this advantage that you do have time, if you take it that way, to talk literally about everything or anything that you want to do. So if you have 10, as we do, hours of programming a week just on our show, you should be able to have a lot of different discussions, a lot of variety. We're trying to do that. I mean, are we perfect? Of course not. Do we fall into some of the traps that other people do? I'm sure sometimes. But I think there is also that advantage that if you're starting from the beginning and rethinking it as we are now, that you start to realize. And I think that, that there could be a better way of doing it.
Well, you do have, as you mentioned, a vantage point of being an insider. You were at Fox Business prior to coming to News Nation. What was your experience there in terms of did you find it was product audience led rather than
briefly? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was at Fox for a long time. And I would just, right, this is probably not the forum to get into all those details. That's more, I save that for the therapist. But I left in May of this year when my contract expired. And the short story on that is that this. So I've been thinking about a lot of these issues that we're talking about today for a long time. But the 2020 election was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. In other words, after the election and the months after the election, trying to be a straight news reporter at Fox was something that I just couldn't do anymore. I just couldn't do it anymore, and made the decision then that I would leave. My contract expired in May of 2023, and I literally walked out that day without a job. So luckily I have a very supportive wife, and she was understanding of that. And then everything I thought about leaving the industry. I thought about doing something else. I started in sports. I thought about getting back to that. I rethought just about everything. But News Nation came along. That's why I say I've been thinking about a lot of these issues with this kind of mission statement that I believed in. I hope it works, but I definitely believed in it. This idea that something new is needed. And they said, we have 2 hours a day that you can go out there and do what you think. I mean, I was aligned with what they thought. You think the way it should be done, and that was like, wow, this is great. So it's been a terrific turnaround for me. But the election was what made me decide to leave, the way it was handled.
One of the more problematic practices of cable news, particularly in prime time, is the use of panels. And the panel presented itself early on in the 24-hour news cycle. It was sort of an elegant solution in a way to fill airtime. For the networks, they filled the time. The pundits got to kind of, the louder that the more aggressive their personalities were, that was rewarded. And it created this kind of rodeo circuit. It eats up a lot of time and a lot of energy, and people conflate that. They think they're watching news. I wonder, I think your respective networks essentially avoid panels, or largely?
Not 100%, but yeah, I mean, maybe probably less. I mean, definitely less percentage-wise than some of the other networks.
Can panels
we don't
work?
Do panels.
Can they work? Can they ever be something that's productively used?
Look, I think there's this false narrative that our responsibility is to fill time. Our responsibility is not to fill time. Our responsibility is to provide information and to allow consumers to make decisions based on the information that we provide. And so for us, that's meant reporting. That's meant journalism. That's meant hiring reporters, using the resources of our local news operations, adding to those resources and putting reporters all over the country, all over the world, and telling stories. Sort of like, for those of us that have been around for a while, CNN started, right? Remember when CNN actually spent 24 hours a day actually covering stories? That's what this is meant to be. And I think you can use panels to help unpack the news. But I think one has to understand that the minute you begin the debate, you begin to shift from journalism to that talk radio model. And that's not to say you can't bring experts on to help you unpack the news of the day. But I think what we tend to do is not bring experts on. We tend to bring opinionated people on the news desk.
Professional pundits.
Professional pundits. So the question isn't, can we bring somebody on to explain what liability President Biden has relative to an impeachment trial with what's going on with Hunter Biden? The question is, what do you feel about it? And what do you feel about it? And let's have you both sort of contribute to the screaming voices.
Right.
And that's, that's the problem. That's not illuminating for the audience.
Right, right. So you both represent upstart national networks, relatively new both, that are aiming to present alternate network models to the country. First, what makes you think that the country wants alternatives? Are we sure that they do?
I will say the country needs alternatives. Am I sure the country wants alternatives? I mean, time will tell.
Yeah, right.
Right?
That's the cliche.
I think I'm concerned, and this company has been around for 145 years, and for the last 100 of those years, we've used the motto, "Give light and the people will find their own way." And that motto is meant to, I think, demonstrate the culture or the mentality that, you present the journalism, and then consumers, audiences are meant to take that information and then decide on their own. Today, our network is distributed to 100% of U.S. households over the air on connected TV, in some cases on pay TV. And so we've gone back to this notion that America needs a democratically delivered a journalism organization, not talk radio, but journalism. And we're betting that the audience will be there. We're seeing that the audience is there, both via data and certainly anecdotally, because there is a thirst for information, particularly from a younger generation that doesn't want to be told how to think. They don't want to be told what to think. So I think both of these organizations are certainly betting that there is a lane for us to operate in.
Yeah, so the short answer is that we don't know. We're too early in this to know for sure. I could give you my opinion on it is that, I've had discussions with people that if, because I assume you're asking essentially at the end of the day, is this a successful business model? Can we make money? Can we exist in the current kind of cable news in our world ecosystem and be successful? I think we can. I don't know. But I would say look at it this way. So if we're trying to avoid the fringes of cable news in the way we kind of go about things, and you say 20% here and 20% here, it still leaves you a lot. That leaves you 60% in the middle. Problem is a lot of those people don't watch television on a regular basis on the news, right? So then you have to say how many of those people can you get to watch your show? So you got to make it a compelling product. It's obviously have to be all the tenets of journalism that we've talked about today. To go back to the discussion about panels, all of these things I don't think are an either or. I think they're a both and. You have to book the right type of people to have interesting discussions, maybe about the reporting that you just did in the block before with the reporter who's on the scene. All of these things can be done if you present a compelling product. I think you get a percentage of that 60, and then in the business model as it currently exists, theoretically you could make money, right? Because the cable companies and the streamers and the rest are going to pay you some sort of a subscriber fee, and if you're not employing crazy people, that hopefully the advertisers will want to be engaged in advertising more and more, and then you make some money. So I think a lot of this will be decided in the next year. To your point, we've already seen a nice bump in our ratings a couple of times since I've been there. It's only been a few months when the news cycle is crazy, as it almost has been the entire time, whether it's the war overseas and all these things going on. We had a Republican debate.
From the debate.
We had a Republican debate on our network. Again, that helps with notoriety. So all these things help. And then I think by the time we're having this conversation, hopefully in a year, we find out that, yeah, we did fit in, but we don't know.
Kathy, you have a quick one?
Balance the massive amount of horse race journalism covering elections with something that's less trivial. I know it's breaking news, but
Yep.
how do you make interesting the policies that will result from either side or all sides?
I could just give one quick example, if that's okay, just because it's just in my mind about the debate. So we had a Republican debate on our network last week. So my show, which is on from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, essentially, I was telling our staff, became like that Super Bowl pregame show that nobody watches at 2 o'clock, but it's still tens of millions of people. You know, you're doing a pregame show for something that's on at 8 o'clock. So you're basically, for better or worse, and from my perspective, a lot of it was tough. You're talking about this debate the whole time, especially on the day of the debate. It's on the network. You know, we had the terrible shooting at UNLV that day, so we broke in a number of times to do that as breaking news. But we're still predominantly talking about the debate. One of the ways we did that, so again, it's both ends. So we did have panels and discussions and all the rest about the horse race because, you know, it is part of it. And, you know, who's winning, who's losing, where are the polls. We also tried to block it out so that we would have a live report, say, from Tel Aviv on the war, and then the next discussion after that would be about that topic and how it related to the campaign. And then we would have another report on, you know, immigration or crime or whatever the topic may be from a reporter on the scene, and then we would have a discussion about the topic. So we're trying to come up with ways to do it that way. But, you know, I'm not going to say we're going to ignore the horse race, but I think we still try to talk about the issues in some sort of depth because, again, we have time to do it.
I think that's reasonable. Every year we get to an election, and every year academics essentially plead with the news media to focus on the substance, the stories, and not the horse race. And you know, the answer is yes. And I mean, the horse race and where things stand is news, and I think to pretend it's not is foolish. However, it's not the only news, and it's probably not the most important news. The most important news is tackling the subjects that impact Americans every day, you know, and focusing not on the Beltway, but on the stories that will change as a result of the election's results.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now. The New York Times has been doing things about that. The Washington Post, great depth there. I'm going to just ask to hold on to the audience questions for a few minutes. I will come back to it because I want to turn the conversation to technology for a few minutes and talk again about generative AI, which will undoubtedly have a transformative effect, a step change on the industry. But it's also going to throw up all these issues to transparency and trust along the way. Adam, what are your biggest concerns in terms of how it can be weaponized against news legitimacy as we move closer to the election?
I mean, we have a trust problem as it is before AI, right? And so anything that could in any way call into question the validity of our reporting and create a scenario where consumers aren't quite sure whether it's real or not is problematic. So, you know, from our perspective, you know, the use of AI I've actually seen pitches in which, you know, people have come to us and said, now, if you don't have a camera there, we can actually create the video as if there was a camera there. And if you label it AI, as long as you're clear, it's all good. And from my perspective, that's not all good, right? That's not journalism. You know, I think the fact is we will see what the impact is. We've already experienced the use of AI with our reporting in social media, in which, you know, not us, but somebody else took one of our news products and made it seem to be something that it was not. It was so outlandish and it was so racist and anti-Semitic that fortunately anybody who saw it on Twitter was going to dismiss it. But if it had just been dialed back a little bit, you might have actually thought our people said those things. And that's really concerning. And so we're developing a trust center online that will allow our consumers to go to a location to verify what is and isn't ours. So, I mean, I'm very concerned about the prospect of the use of AI to disintermediate us, the use of AI to, damage our brands. Frankly, the use of AI in our business to inadvertently create or exacerbate that trust problem. All of those things are on the table at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I would say from my perspective, I'm generally very excited when new technology comes into our industry and want to be one of the first ones to use it. I mean, so we started in radio with a tape recorder, a cassette tape and a big Marantz, and now it's like people walk around with their phones or some other digitalized way of gathering audio, and the same's true in TV. And, right before this job, my most recent job was out in the field reporting. I love to use drones and anything that was coming in, the little Osmo cameras that you could walk in, went to a little market in China with one of those. Probably shouldn't talk about this if the CCP is watching at the moment, but we were able to get some great video. But so all that stuff's great because it helps us do our job, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm concerned about, obviously, is the technology that can do our job for us, and that's where my reluctance is. I heard some of the earlier panels. I'd love to be in a situation, I think we're just about there, where some huge news breaks during the show, and it's maybe it's contained in a 400-page document, and you have to synthesize that, and obviously doing that in real time. Yeah, but I'm not personally comfortable yet with anything that I've been shown that I would say, all right, let's do that and put it on our show. But I think we're almost there. So I see the good in it, but I'm definitely skeptical about what I don't know enough about yet, and kind of reluctant to adapt it as opposed to those other technology innovations and improvements that I was kind of right on top of from day one and excited about.
Look, there will be significant opportunity to leverage AI in a way that enhances news gathering appropriately, in a way that brings efficiency to news operations, in a way that brings efficiency to the backroom operations of all sorts of companies, journalism companies, cardboard box manufacturers, whatever, that hopefully companies will then use to maybe alleviate some of the pressure on the newsroom from an economic perspective. So this is not an all bad story, but I think we just have to be, it's not a bad story at all. We just have to be thoughtful about how we use this in just the way he's describing.
I want to ask one more thing, and then I'll come back to your question. A now oft-quoted October survey from the Public Religion Research Institute found 38% of Americans supported having a president, quote, willing to break some rules to set things right, end quote, with the country, and 48% of Republicans supported that view. How does television news respond to this dynamic? What is your obligation to democracy when it would seem that a large tranche of your viewership may be gravitating toward anti-democratic principles?
So look, I think this goes exactly to why we're executing this news initiative that I started with, and that was typically, especially in rural areas, in a lot of places where, the newspapers are gone at this point. If you go out and speak to those consumers, those audiences that are on the edges of our markets, and you listen to what they say, they don't trust us because we're not there for them, okay? They don't trust us because, as they say, you only show up when something terrible happens. And why do we do that? Because from an economic perspective, especially in smaller markets, we have not enough resources. And so when I talk about the reason why we've put more resources in the market and why we've dedicated those reporters to living in the communities that they're serving, it's because we have alienated large swaths of this population, both demographic and geographic. And we've seen that in studies that we've done on the Black population, on the Latinx population. We've seen it in the studies we've done on the urban and rural divide. And so it's not a surprise to me when those people express opinions that then we sort of find surprising. I mean, we're surprised by this or upset by this, but this has been happening under our nose and we haven't been covering it. And so I think our obligation to rebuild trust is to get back into the communities where those people live and to cover their lives, not just when there's a quadruple homicide, but when there's a real issue at stake and there's nobody else there who will step up and tell their stories. And that is much more likely, I think, to have them understand the role of journalism in society and the way a news operation can provide them with information than to sort of almost demonize their view based on who they support in the White House. I've got my personal opinions and then I've got my professional opinions. And professionally, we sort of have to, have some humble pie about where we are today and recognize that we are responsible for this, for creating this dynamic, and we can get ourselves out of it, but we have to be dedicated or committed to actually resourcing, covering these communities where these people live.
Yeah, showing up, I think, is a big part of it. I've always said that it's like the easiest part about our job is to show up. I'm still kind of having, and a lot of this goes back to economics now and resources. We're at a news network, News Nation might not have as many resources, some of the more established networks, so maybe getting as many places as I would like might not be as easy as another place. So I'm continually pushing to get out from our studio and go places, and that's always something that I've thought made me better at what I did. And then I think the second part of it is once you go to those places, it sounds simple, but I don't think it's done enough, is listen and don't be a jerk when you're there. I think tone matters. I think listening to people and acknowledging their issues as real issues and not prejudging their condition or their opinion on something is important, because if you want to establish trust and credibility with a certain group of people, acknowledging and listening to those people and going to where they live and, to your point, and talking to them, it helps to do that. And that's true across any kind of socioeconomic group. And so if we're going to do it in one group, you got to do it in the other. And then over time, to the point we made at the beginning of the panel, I think you build that up. But you got to show up. And it costs money sometimes to show up.
It does that.
People feel this way because they feel left behind. And we have also left them behind. And so if we don't want to be left behind in mass, as broadcasters or as journalists, we need to, as you said, show up.
Right, and it kind of speaks against technology to some degree, but you got to show up in person as much as you possibly can.
Of course, technology is making that easier to do, and field production costs are going down because
absolutely.
of technology.
That's true too.
You want to?
Thank you. Rebecca Hansen, head of the North American Broadcasters Association. My question goes to trust, credibility, brand protection, et cetera. I'm wondering, how important is it for you, especially at the local level with respect to investigative reporting, to try to measure the effectiveness of your stories? And the reason I ask this is because a couple weeks ago, I was listening to NPR, and the reporter said, based on our reporting on this issue, the VA has recently, I think it was, returned forgiveness on, or mortgage loan payments or something for veterans. And it struck me that that reporter was explaining to me partly what his job is, not just reporting the news, but creating some sort of relationship to their reporting and moving a policy issue. So I was just wondering, was that a fluke, or is that something that you guys actually think about?
I think proof of performance is critical. And especially nowadays, I think you have to explain what we exist for and what we're there for. I think we have to demystify the work we do. We have to pull the curtain back during the process of investigation or storytelling, and then afterwards. And oftentimes, for example, when I think about sunshine laws or when I think about FOIA requests, people think that these rules or these laws exist for us. And that's because we generally use them in a vacuum. What we actually need to do is remind them that these rules and laws exist for you. They exist for them, right? They are the underpinning of a transparent democracy, and we're just a vehicle. But because we've spent so many years sort of being the voice of God or the authority figure and not being in a dialogue and not always being willing to explain why we do things or how we do things, we've gotten ourselves to this place. And so we talk all the time not about just authenticity and performance, but authenticity and news gathering, and making sure that we're inviting people into the process, especially as we think of our investigative reporters, and then afterwards reminding people and taking some credit, to be honest, for what it is we exist for.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes they can seem performative or self-serving, I think, but it does serve a purpose. That's a good point.
Well, journalism is a show your work enterprise.
Yeah.
It's like
Right.
a math problem. We just have time for one more question, and I want to ask you, we're a nation awash in media options, but we're struggling across the country with a terrible media literacy problem. And by and large, our electorate often has very poorly developed skills in contextualizing information that they consume and assessing the factual value and validity of media sources that are presented to them. And of course, this has been accelerated by cable networks conflating news and opinion, especially in prime time in the mornings, as we discussed. I wonder how you can, from your respective positions do something about this issue? How can we use the media to help media literacy be cultivated more widely?
Well, we are doing something. We've been doing something for a long time. We've partnered with the News Literacy Project and with the NLP started News Literacy Week, in which we, and we've been joined now by several of our peer companies, as well as on the print side and the digital side, to kick off an annual process in which we, again, bring greater transparency to the news process. We spend the entire week explaining how it is we do things and why we do them. The News Literacy Project itself is a project that has developed a curriculum. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's developed a curriculum that goes into middle school, junior high to actually teach these skills, because as we've, as a country, moved towards teaching to the test, with math and science and English and history, we've eliminated civics, and media evaluation is essentially gone in many cases from the curriculum. So we are graduating kids into the most complex content ecosystem ever to exist, with none of the skills necessary to be able to understand what is propaganda, what is journalism, what is a press release. So we have dedicated ourselves to working with the NLP on this, and I would invite others to join this fight. Not just because it's an existential threat to our business. I mean, obviously, if you don't recognize the difference between journalism and a press release, it's an existential threat to the journalist and to the business model we have, but because it's an existential threat to our democracy.
Yeah, I spent most of my career up until now, or the majority of it percentage-wise, in financial news. So I think financial literacy is another issue that's been huge in this country that we're not doing enough about, that maybe we're starting projects like this. And the same goes for media literacy. So I think our organization is involved in similar projects. I think from where I would sit, I would go back to what I talked about earlier, is that some of this stuff doesn't happen overnight, but if you're in a position where you can do a good job every day, as old-fashioned and simple as it sounds, that, you know, over time people start to trust that guy with the news, and, you know, we have a whole organization of those men and women that people trust with the news, and then you build up the literacy that way. So I think it's a multi-step process. I think organizations and programs like that are important, and I think, you know, people watching or paying attention to the news in high school or even younger than that, something we could have more of. I think it's the first time I ever saw Anderson Cooper was on Channel 1 when I was in high school, even though he's less than 10 years older than me. He was diving behind places in Somalia when they used to do that. So we used to watch it every day in high school, the news, the real news that they were producing back then. I'm sure things like that still exist. I know CNN does some stuff like that. So anything that can increase people and get them interested in it, I think, is positive. And, you know, and embracing other ways of broadcasting and making sure that there are credible sources of news on social media platforms, TikTok even, and all the rest, I think is also a part of it as well.
Okay. Well, we have come up against our time, ladies and gentlemen, so please thank my lovely panelists here today for this keynote discussion.